Hi everyone, happy Pride. Today is Sunday, June 28th, 2020, 50 years to the day after the world's first Pride March. As you know, because of the pandemic, Pride celebrations across the world have been canceled. The Stonewall Inn is closed right now. Our traditions have been brought to a halt. But I wanted to make this video to suggest something a bit radical. Maybe it's not so bad that Pride is canceled this year. Maybe it's exactly what our community needs. After all, the silence allows us to stop, reflect, and ask, what exactly is Pride? And what does it mean to celebrate Pride without parades? And once this crisis is over, how do we reconstruct the symbolic birthday of our fight for liberation? As a historian of the American gay rights movement, I think the answer can be found in the past, before the parades, and even before Stonewall. But hear me out. After spending the past 7 years combing through tens of thousands of documents, preserved by pre-Stonewall gay activists, hidden in recently declassified FBI files, and stored in federal warehouses, I learned that Pride did not appear spontaneously, the result of a single riot. It didn't even arise from the craziness of the late 1960s. For nearly a decade before Stonewall, activists, beginning with Dr. Frank Kameny, a government astronomer fired from his Defense Department job simply for being gay, increasingly fought the government's systematic persecution of gay federal employees by claiming that homosexuality was not immoral, but rather morally good. Persecution, in other words, gave rise to Pride. 5 years before Stonewall, queer activists marched, inspired by the 1963 March on Washington, organized by Bayard Rustin, himself a black gay man. Activists began picketing the federal government in 1964. The next year, Frank Kameny's own group, the Mattachine Society of Washington, began marching in front of the White House and other sites of federal power. Each subsequent year, at annual Reminder Day demonstrations at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Frank Kameny required male marchers to wear suits and female marchers to wear dresses. If homosexuals wanted to fight for equal employment, he explained, they needed to look and act employable. He barred anyone who did not comply with his rules, and only a few dozen ever participated in these demonstrations. But after Stonewall, when the most marginalized elements of society, drag queens, trans people, gender nonconforming folks, and homeless youth, put their bodies on the line to fight police oppression, a new generation of activists stopped tolerating Kameny's rules. And in November 1969, at a homophile organizing conference, these activists proposed that the annual reminder be moved in time and location to better reflect, quote, the larger struggle in which we are engaged, that of our fundamental human rights. The new march, which prohibited a dress code, would take place each June on the anniversary of the riots. And so, Pride as we know it was born. As part of the official schedule, activists picketed Governor Rockefeller's office, fighting for LGBTQ+ law reform. They organized workshops on gay economic power and political organizing. Artists performed street theater in Sheridan Square. Dances raised money for activist organizations. Pride, above all, meant fighting back. At 2 p.m. on Sunday, June 28, 1970, less than 1,000 people gathered at Sheridan Square next to the Stonewall Inn. Many were nervous. Organizers had instructed them not to wear glasses or necklaces to avoid the risk of getting punched or strangled by angry onlookers. But as the demonstrators marched up 6th Avenue, they became increasingly confident. They became encouraged, and crowds of hesitant homosexuals watching from the sidewalk began to join. Without barriers separating them, emboldened spectators became marchers. By the time the marchers reached Central Park, the crowd had swelled to 5,000 people. Dr. Frank Kameny, who had been marching near the front of the crowd, arrived in a polo shirt. He carried a sign that said simply, "Gay is good." It was the happiest day of his life. But now, exactly 50 years later, the holiday has changed. Pride, just like Christmas, is about the festivities, the gifts, the conspicuous consumption, the parade, the rainbow trinkets, and the obscenely expensive parties. The spirit, the resistance, is gone. Corporations pay $2,000 for permission to drive a parade float that costs thousands of additional dollars to decorate. We can get married and drink from rainbow vodka bottles, but 28 states lacked laws against LGBTQ+ discrimination in employment and housing until this past week. Trans Americans can't serve in the military, and Black trans women especially are routinely murdered on account of their identity. A third of homeless youth kicked out of their homes are queer. Our history offers us hope, but it also warns us that we can't let the trappings of our holiday, the floats, the parties, the image, overshadow its purpose. It tells us that if we don't continuously fight for the most marginalized members of our community, if we don't adapt, if we don't declare that Black Lives Matter, then we will be left behind, and future generations will judge us accordingly. History offers us a template of what pride should look like, and today's activists have proven that a return to pride's fundamentals is possible. Last year in New York, 45,000 people participated in an alternative march organized by the Reclaim Pride Coalition. They marched to resist police and state oppression, to resist economic inequality, and to demand universal health care. They traveled north to Central Park, just as they did in 1970. And without barriers along much of the route, spectators could witness the march and on a whim, join the resistance. Randy Wicker, the 81-year-old organizer of America's first march for gay rights back in 1964, marched in his wheelchair. Now, in the disquieting stillness of 2020, with the parades and the parties canceled, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to take a breath, to look backwards, and to rebuild the entirety of Pride. Just as Stonewall changed a movement, signaling that the marches need to become larger and more inclusive and more militant, COVID-19 can do the same for us. So that's why I think we need to make a few permanent changes for next year and each year thereafter. First, Pride parades need to return into their original form as marches that explicitly resist our oppression, open to all, marches in solidarity and cooperation with Black Lives Matter. Second, Pride organizations need to permanently cut all ties to corporate sponsors, which inevitably control explicitly or implicitly the messaging of resistance. Third, if companies want to support Pride, then 100% of their budget should be spent on organizations fighting for those who have been left behind in our movement. The National Center for Transgender Equality, the National Black Justice Coalition, and the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, just to name a few. Fourth, and finally, we as a community must boycott corporations that plagiarize our rainbow, unless 100% of profits from a Pride campaign are directed towards the continuing fight for equality. These changes are significant, but they're precedented. 50 years ago, we abandoned the facade of straight respectability. And now we need to shed the rainbow chains of our corporate sponsors. This year, as we celebrate Pride in a pandemic, we can celebrate just as we did before the parades. We can expose and battle injustice wherever it exists. We can donate to organizations that are still fighting for our rights. We can support queer artists. We can learn our history. And we can start planning for next year. We can join local Pride organizations en masse, stage an intervention, and articulate new visions for the occasion. We can demand that Pride return as a synonym of resistance, and we can create a holiday that is, once again, our own. Thanks everyone, stay safe, and happy Pride.